I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Jennifer Back. As a naturalist at ACES, I've spent a lot of time learning and talking about water systems in the West, and I'm also a very passionate outdoor enthusiast and have been lucky enough to spend time on the Green River in Utah, a magical river that flows through some canyons. Jennifer also loves rivers and has dedicated herself to the conservation of these wild spaces. Jennifer retired from the National Park Service in 2021 after working for 21 years as a hydrologist in the Water Resources Division. She was responsible for developing policy, legal, and technical strategies to protect water and water-dependent resources of wild and scenic rivers. In her free time, Jennifer enjoys biking, skiing, and hiking with her husband. And tonight, Jennifer is here to share how these free-flowing rivers provide essential habitat for aquatic species in a changing world. So, welcome, Jennifer. And please remember to hold your questions until the end, where we'll have a brief Q&A session. Alrighty, please welcome Jennifer Back.
So, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is a really special place to be, and so I'm so thankful to be invited to come here, and I'm thankful that you guys all came out to hear this. Wild and scenic rivers are really special to me. I think it's really a very cool thing. I work for the Park Service, and this is not just a Park Service thing. This is a national system of rivers, and it's very cool. So I'm glad to be here. So the title of my talk is Born to be Wild, the Ecological Benefits of Wild and Scenic Rivers. They have a lot of benefits, but let's talk tonight about the ecological benefits. And this title comes from the idea that all rivers are born to be wild, but very few of them remain that way today. And it's because of all kinds of different things that go on that we use rivers for, we need the water for, but dams, channelization, levees, those kinds of things can fragment a river and affect its ecology. And so tonight we're going to talk about a group of rivers, a collection of rivers that are special, that still have some of those characteristics of wild rivers and support different ecological values. So let's get started. So I plan to give you an introduction to the wild and scenic rivers and the system for those of you that are not familiar with them. And then we'll get into the ecological benefits. And I want to share with you some examples of rivers throughout the country that provide different values and benefits. And then I'll have a few remarks about the role of wild and scenic rivers in river conservation near the end. So the national system of wild and scenic rivers it's a national system. There's rivers all over the countries. Currently, there are 228 designated rivers, or I should say river segments, because they rarely are the entire length of a river. But they're in 40 different states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. They're managed by one of 4 federal agencies, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, who I worked with, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And currently there's about a little bit less than 14,000 miles of river protected in the system, which is really just a small fraction of the rivers overall in the US. So the National Wild and Scenic River System came about largely because of dams. And what I'm showing you here are a couple of graphs. The one on the top is showing the cumulative number of dams that were built in the US in the last 100 years or so, or I guess it's actually a little bit longer than that. But, and then underneath that is the number of dams built annually. And you can see that sometime around 1950 in the US, we really ramped up our dam development. But there's what we call the era of big dam building, which was in the mid-1900s. And that's when a lot of our really large dams were being built. They were being built for various purposes: navigation, flood control, hydropower, irrigation, water supply, and other purposes. They came about largely in around the 1930s when Hoover Dam was built. in response to the Depression. And we were trying to get people back to work, and water resource projects, not just dams, but other big projects were being built at that time. So there's currently about 90,000 dams in the US. These are big dams, medium or big, large-sized dams in the US, and they impound more than 600,000 miles of river. So I mentioned the Hoover Dam, completed in 1933. That dam is 726 feet high. At the time it was built, it was the largest dam in the world. It no longer has that status, but Hoover Dam built in 1933. The Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River, built around the same time, it completed a few years later. Fort Peck Dam on the Missouri River, completed several years later. At its widest point, Fort Peck Dam is 3.5 miles wide, so you can imagine the amount of water that's being held back by that dam. And then finally, this dam, Oroville Dam, is currently the largest dam in California, in the US. It's in California on the Feather River, which happens to be a wild and scenic river above this dam. So today we know that dams, have a lot of negative effects. We didn't really look at those effects during that period of large dam building. That wasn't something that we were thinking about. The Environmental Protection Agency wasn't around until the 70s. And so we weren't doing these, really looking at the environmental impacts. But today we know that they cause various things: habitat fragmentation, loss of biodiversity and native species, disruption of natural flow, not just of water, but sediment, and degradation of water quality. There's some concerns about the water quality in reservoirs above dams, but also the water that's being released. And a big thing is they impede fish migration, so that fish that need to go back up and down a river, of course a dam is a really big deal for them. So, and they destroy critical habitat as well. So the idea for the National Wild and Scenic River System was conceived in Montana. It is really largely due to these two brothers, Frank and John Craighead. We owe a lot to them. They were twin brothers. They were wildlife biologists, mostly working on grizzly bears in Glacier National Park. And they, at the time, this was in the 1950s, were fighting a dam called the Spruce Park Dam. And it was proposed on the middle fork of the Flathead River, which is just south of Glacier National Park. And that dam I think it was going to be about 400 feet high. But the thing was that the South Fork already had a dam. Now there was this proposal on the Middle Fork, and there were also rumblings of a dam on the North Fork of the Flathead. And so they were very concerned about this, and they recognized that we needed a more comprehensive way of looking at our rivers and evaluating them and being able to say whether they had other uses other than building a dam. So they wanted to be more proactive about protecting rivers. And so they really were really important in the early days of this Wild and Scenic River System. So in the late 1950s, I think it was John Craighead, I might be wrong, it might have been his brother Frank, but he wrote an article in the Montana Game and Fish Department publication, and he talked about the need for this national system. He was really focused on wild rivers at the time, but he felt like we could protect wilderness, we could protect wild areas, but if we also needed to protect our rivers. And so he wrote that article in 1957. It was 11 years later that the act was finally signed. It took a lot of effort to bring people together to actually agree to what was in the act. But Lyndon B. Johnson, writing at the time when he signed the act, said, "We're establishing a national wild and scenic river system which will complement our river development with a policy to preserve sections of selected rivers in their free-flowing conditions and to protect their water quality and other vital conservation values." So he acknowledged that there were multiple uses of rivers, but we needed to also have some rivers that were set aside to be protected. So the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act says, it's hereby declared to be the policy of the U.S. We're going to set aside certain rivers with their immediate environments where they possess outstandingly remarkable values, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. But these rivers shall be preserved in free-flowing condition, and that they and their immediate environment shall be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of future generations. So this idea of free-flowing condition is really fundamental to the wild and scenic river system. And there's three things that every wild and scenic river has to have. It has to have free-flowing condition, a good water quality or ability to improve water quality, and I'll talk a little more about that, but also these outstanding remarkable values. But free-flowing condition, this was the first time we really saw this kind of language in any legislation anywhere in the world. And what it said is that a free-flowing river is flowing in natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, rip-wrapping, or other modification of the waterway. Now, this doesn't mean that our wild and scenic rivers can't have some of these things on them, and we do have rivers that have rip-wrap. We have rivers that have some diversions on them, those kinds of things. But the idea is that so long as the function of a free-flowing river is still preserved with the processes and the flows that are going on, then it can meet that criteria of being a free-flowing river. So I said free-flowing condition is a fundamental value, water quality is a fundamental value. Remember that in the 1960s was a time when we were really becoming aware of water pollution issues. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson came out, and she was warning about DDT. Also, the fires on the Cuyahoga River, there wasn't one, there were many, and they were largely due to industrial waste just being dumped into a river. So, you know, there was this growing awareness that water quality was an issue, and these rivers have language in them that protects their water quality. And what it says is basically that together, river managers, states, and the EPA are required to work cooperatively to eliminate pollution. It says states, who are the water quality regulatory agencies, they're the ones that regulate water quality, are required to provide wild and scenic rivers with the strongest level of protection from water pollution. And so when they develop standards for a water body, they're supposed to give the highest standards to rivers that are designated. And then finally, there's this language that talks about not just protecting what's there, but enhancing what's there. So if there's the ability to improve water quality, even if it's meeting standards, then that should also be a goal of management. And then there's these outstandingly remarkable values. Not off-road vehicles. We call them ORVs all the time, and I know people that aren't as familiar might get a little confused by that, but these are the special qualities of a river. And every wild and scenic river has to have at least one of these that's truly remarkable for that area or region. In the early days, they were generally history and culture, scenery, fish and wildlife, recreation, and geology, but we're starting to see a lot more qualities or values being identified as ORVs. So it can be ecology, it can be hydrology, it can be botany. There's a lot of different things that we now see as ORVs. So the main purpose, just to review, the main purpose of the Act was to preserve free-flowing condition, protect and enhance water quality, and to protect those outstanding remarkable values of the river and its immediate environments. So let's talk about the ecological benefits of wild and scenic rivers. There's 7 things up here, but the first 3 are really what I want to talk about the most. They're these physical processes that really shape the other things that I'll be talking about tonight. But so there's 7 things: flow regime, hydrologic connectivity, river complexity, biodiversity, riparian buffers, refugia, and resilience. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those and the role that wild and scenic rivers have in supporting these values. So one of the most important things about a free-flowing river is this idea of a natural flow regime. And this doesn't mean that the river has all of its flow, but there's functional components of flow that are really important to ecosystems. So the natural flow regime is the idea that the ecological integrity of river ecosystems depends on a river's natural variability of stream flow, which means the patterns of flow that you see in a river, high flows and low flows, they both serve a purpose when we're talking about ecosystems. And the natural flow regime drives a range of physical and biological processes that shape the river channel, what it looks like, influence water quality and nutrient cycling, and sustain native biodiversity. So when we talk about the natural flow regime, ecologists often call it a master variable because it has such a strong controlling and regulating effect on other processes that are going on in the river. And so what is the natural flow regime? What does that mean? Well, there's really just 5 things to think about when you're thinking about the flow regime. And those are the magnitude, frequency, duration, rate of change, and timing of stream flow. And all of those things have some importance to the ecological integrity of rivers. An example that I like to use is the idea of cottonwood trees that grow alongside rivers. And they have evolved over time to release their seeds just after peak stream flow has come along and scoured sandbars and made these areas along the river cleared of other vegetation and moist. And so the seedlings or the seeds fall on the moist sandbars, and they can they're moist so they can grow. And another flood is presumably not going to come along because it's after the period of peak flow. So so different species are tied to different environmental processes and cues that we see in the river. Water quality, food and energy sources, again, the channel shape and pattern, and the assemblages of aquatic organisms depend on components of stream flow. And so that's the point I was going to make about how different species respond to environmental cues. Another example are salmon, for example. They start to migrate and spawn based on flow conditions and temperature of the water. So they're tied to these different environmental cues that are going on in the river. The second thing I wanted to talk about is hydrologic connectivity. And this is the idea that rivers flow or rivers have movement along 4 different dimensions. Lateral is pretty easy to think about. A river might migrate back and forth across its floodplain. Longitudinal has to do with the idea of flow moving downstream generally, but think also about organisms that need to go back upstream like fish. So it is this upstream, downstream continuity or connectivity. Vertical, the vertical dimension is interactions between the bed of the channel and the shallow groundwater underneath. And so there's a lot of cycling and biogeochemical activity that's going on there. So that's really important as well. And then finally, time is the 4th dimension, just the idea that there's this seasonal and annual variability in flows. And we don't want to interrupt that. So hydrologic connectivity allows migratory fish passage, links terrestrial and aquatic environments, transports water, sediment, organic material, and nutrients, promotes biogeochemical cycling, and then maintains a sediment balance and sustains aquatic organisms. And then the third physical process that I wanted to talk about was geomorphic complexity. And what this has to do with is really the spatial heterogeneity of a river. So in this picture, we're looking at the Mackenzie River in Oregon. There's a lot of stuff in the river, right? There's rocks and logs and things like that in the river. Compare that to a canal that might be concrete lined. It might have a uniform slope. It might have uniform sides or channel margins. So that's very different than what we're seeing here. And so that's what we mean by geomorphic complexity. And there's a saying now, comes from a woman here in Colorado: a messy river is a healthy river. So that's a simple way of thinking about it. Geomorphic complexity influences habitat abundance and diversity, promotes retention of water, sediment, and nutrients in the little spaces behind a log or behind a rock. Even those little spaces where the velocity of the water might be a little bit less, living organisms can find a way to live in those places. So it is a small, very small, perhaps habitat, but something for organisms to thrive in. It also increases resilience to natural and human disturbances. So a river that has complexity like this is better able to adjust to short-term disturbances that might occur. So when we talk about geomorphic complexity, we dive into it a little bit more. It has to do with this idea of different sediment sizes in the river. So clay, silt, gravel, cobbles, and then boulders. That's one way of describing complexity. We also can think about longitudinal profile. When you look at a river, very rarely is it one smooth slope. It has steps and pools and riffles. All of those things are adding complexity to the river. The cross-sectional shape of a river is important as well. The idea that some rivers are V-shaped, they're carving through a narrow canyon. You might have a U-shaped river. And then there's these rivers that are broad and shallow and meandering across a floodplain. So there's all these different kinds of cross-sectional views of a river. And then there's the bird's eye view, the planned form of a river, which has to do with, again, the meandering, the braidedness of a channel, and maybe there's there's backwater or that kind of thing. So the planned form of a channel also contributes to geomorphic complexity. And finally, this idea of in-stream wood. We're realizing, we have realized, I guess, the effects of wood on habitat. It's really important for organisms, not just, as I said before, providing sort of habitat in the river behind that, or in the areas that have less velocity, but also organisms are breaking it down. And so some of that material gets cycled or broken down and becomes food or energy for other organisms. So there is really some great work that's been done on the importance of having wood in the river for ecological values. So all of those things, the free-flowing condition of a river, the hydrologic connectivity of a river, and the geomorphic complexity all contribute to biodiversity. And so this is sort of an idealized view of a river. It's taken from rivers in Montana, but it's the idea that you have all of these different things happening along what's considered a fairly healthy river system. We have microbes processing organic matter in the bed of the river, and invertebrates or insects living in the interstitial spaces in the river. We have fish feeding on those insects and then spawning and migrating. Groundwater is coming up and actually moderating water temperature. It's very important during the summer months to provide small areas for fish to go to on occasion when flows are low and that kind of thing. Birds feed on insects and nest in the riparian habitat along a river. Amphibians live in backwaters. riparian vegetation grows on those fresh surfaces that have been made available by the scouring processes of the river. And then ungulates feed on that aquatic vegetation, and finally predators hunt and den in those river corridors. So all of these processes are supporting different individual species, but also this whole interactive complexity of different species living in an area, an ecosystem. So, so thinking about that, riparian areas are really important for habitat. They represent the transitional zone between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So they're the areas along the margins of the river that are wet sometimes and sometimes dry, but they're extremely efficient at trapping sediments and filtering nutrients like nitrates and phosphates from runoff. So in urban areas, having a healthy riparian zone can really help with your water quality because it filters some of the nitrates and phosphates that might be in the runoff, or in an agricultural system as well. Having a healthy riparian system can really be helpful for the water quality. It's marked by diverse and dynamic habitats that support native biodiversity. So again, this is the area along the margin of the river. It's subject to floods and then drying. There's all this stuff that's happening in the river, energy that's moving things around, scouring, sandbars, that kind of thing. So there's a whole mosaic of different kinds of habitats that are being formed and disturbed and then formed again. So it's a very diverse and dynamic area. And then there's a lot of work that shows that these riparian corridors are they may represent a very small percentage of a watershed in terms of area, but more than 90%, and in some cases 98% of the biogeochemical processing, the breaking down of organic matter, is occurring in those areas. So really important. And finally, it's this idea of flood attenuation. So they're not just filtering runoff that's coming from land use along the sides of the river, but they're actually protecting that land also from flooding, because if you have a healthy riparian area, it can help attenuate or mitigate some of the impacts of flooding. So really important to have a healthy system like that. This is something I really am always fascinated by, but this idea of refugia. And what this is just habitat that organisms may retreat to or persist in and potentially expand from under changing environmental conditions. This is a photo of the Amargosa River in California. It's just outside Death Valley National Park. So it gets less than 4 inches of rain a year. And yet here is a river that has perennial flow and has some really amazing vegetation growing along it. It has all kinds of different little critters living in that area too. But the reason it's there is it's fed by a very large regional groundwater system where the snow is occurring way up high in the mountains, recharging and flowing under the ground and coming out along springs along this river. So really important to have areas like this that it may be very isolated, and maybe things are not going to move out of an area like this, but it still provides tremendous diversity for an area that would otherwise be very dry. So the other way of looking at refugia is it may be habitat that provides biotic communities with spatial and/or temporal resistance to natural or anthropogenic disturbances. So I mentioned the idea of groundwater coming up in a stream bed, and it's a little bit cooler so fish can hang out there when it's really cold. That could, in a way, be thought of as refugia. And what we're finding is that with the whole idea of climate change, headwater streams in some of our mountains, where these areas are protected, they are providing habitat for fish and providing areas for fish to live and continue to thrive because of the environmental conditions associated with them. So whether it's groundwater upwelling or a north slope that tends to be cooler than a south slope. Those kinds of things can also be sort of refugia that provide a place for communities or species to hang out when conditions aren't great. But so protected areas like parks or wild and scenic rivers and wildlife refuges or forests can be population strongholds and function as refugia for different critters. And so this last final thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of resilience. And this is something we're hearing more and more. Often it's associated with coastal areas and storms, but it really applies to all areas of our environment. So it's the idea that it's the idea of ecosystems being able to absorb or mitigate and respond to disturbance in a way that maintains essentially the same form and function. So it can still do the same things and support the same species, even though there may be some disturbances that are occurring. But in simple terms, it's the ability to thrive under change. And so a river that has connectivity, that has a free-flowing condition, that has that complex spatial complexity or geomorphic complexity, that improves a river's capacity to adjust and recover following floods and fires. Another example I have been using recently is, there were these horrible fires along the Poudre River in Colorado over the last several years. And this is an area that where it's my watershed, it's where I live. But anyway, so those fires, they were really hot fires. They burned over really large areas, really destructive. And after those fires came these floods, and the floods washed a lot of sediment into the rivers, into a lot of mostly into the smaller, tributaries and that kind of thing, but into the main stem as well. But what we are seeing on that river is some really amazing recovery. And it has to do with the idea that because the river is free-flowing for the most part, it's able to move that sediment out, and it has moved a lot of, right after the fire you would see, several inches of silt and ash in the silt and mud along the sides of the river, and it was gone within a few years. So partly because we had some really big floods, but they were able to move some of that sediment out. So just the idea that when we have some of those functions still going on in a river, it really does give it some resilience to these things that happen. The other thing about hydrologic connectivity, river complexity, all of that stuff, is that species may be able to move back into a disturbed area and recolonize more quickly than in an area that's fragmented with dams or whatever it might be. So they can hang out in their little refugia for a while and then hopefully come back. And on the Poudre River, that is what happened. So yeah, just this idea of resilience and being able to recover from disturbance or change. So I wanted to highlight 4 different rivers in 4 different parts of the US. And these are all wild and scenic rivers. But we have the Middle Fork of the Salmon in Idaho. We have the Verde River in the canyons of Arizona. We have the Wekiva River in the subtropics of Florida. And we have the Lower Farmington and Salmon Brook. It's the main tributary to the Lower Farmington River in the woodlands of Connecticut. So 4 very different parts of the country, 4 very different rivers. So let's look at them a little bit. The Middle Fork of the Salmon contains, this is a river that's about 104 miles long, I think, so a fairly long section of river, and the entire segment is protected. So from its source down to where it flows into the Salmon River, it's protected. It's in Forest Service land. It contains high quality, diverse, functioning aquatic habitats that provide strongholds for 15 native fishes, including one of the best remaining populations of Chinook salmon. It supports a host of other federally listed and recently delisted species, including peregrine falcon, bald eagle, and gray wolf, and some sensitive native plant species as well. And just a point about those Chinook salmon that are found in this area. Most Chinook salmon in the Middle Fork, in fact, I think like 98% or something like that, there's not a lot of them, but the ones that are there are wild. They're not from hatcheries, and they retain this high genetic diversity, which is key to resiliency and key to the long-term survival of the species. So these fish in Idaho have to navigate. They start in Idaho up high in the mountains. They have to swim down the salmon to the Snake River and into the Columbia River and out to the ocean, where they spend a couple years and then turn around and come back. And when they come back, they have to negotiate 8 of those huge dams. So those little fish are pretty remarkable. We have to, I think, acknowledge that. But what we're finding is that without that protected area way up high, we wouldn't still have these fish here. Even though things aren't great for them along that entire corridor, that area up high in the mountains is essential to their continuing survival. So really, really important for those fish. And I will just mention there's talk of removing some of those dams, so that's pretty interesting. Wekiva Wild and Scenic River in Florida, totally different part of the world. It's one of the few remaining near pristine rivers in Florida, and it's a pretty neat space. Supports extensive floodplains with significant spring-fed components. So you may be familiar with some of the karst systems in Florida, which is basically like limestone, and there's these springs that come up through that karst that support parts of the river and different habitat. But wildlife is abundant, including protected and iconic species such as the manatee, which I love, Florida black bear, this lovely wood stork, bald eagle, and sandhill crane are all found along this area. And then I think one of the important things about this river, at least in my opinion, is this idea that this river corridor, it's about 60 miles, is protected. There's no federal land. It's protected. It's all state and locally owned conservation lands. And so it's a group of local communities that have gotten together and working with a partner, which was the National Park Service, they've been able to protect this corridor that provides all of this habitat for different species. The Lower Farmington Wild and Scenic River in Connecticut supports 19 state-listed plant species, at least 30 species of finfish, which are trout. The corridor supports migratory fish, including American shad, blueback herring, alewife, American eel, and Atlantic salmon. All of those fish are fish that spend part of their life in the ocean and then come back. It also supports 12 native southern New England freshwater mussels. And these are not like zebra mussels or quagga mussels that we may read about and clog up pipes and are really a nuisance and cover actually lake beds and that kind of thing. These are different. They're native. They're not as prolific as those other mussels. And they really provide an important service to us by filtering out large quantities of algae and bacteria and silt and those other kinds of things. So we have one of the strongest or best communities of dwarf wedge mussel on this river. So really important for that. And finally, Verde, the Verde Wild and Scenic River in Arizona. It's literally an oasis in the desert. It has outstanding habitat that supports 10 native warm water fish, including Colorado pike minnow, razorback sucker, and the Gila top minnow, they're all endangered. It hosts more than 200 bird species, 90 mammal species, and 70 native reptile and amphibian species. So again, this corridor is really important to protecting a lot of different kinds of species because of some of the processes and functions that are going on in the river. It is one of the last remaining Fremont cottonwood and Gooding willow gallery forests. These are mature forests of cottonwood and willow trees. But it provides a lot of habitat for all of these different species by having the processes that can support those trees. So what is the role of wild and scenic rivers in conservation? How well did we do? Remember what Lyndon B. Johnson said, that we're setting aside these rivers for vital conservation purposes. Well, they provide hydrologic connections, sediment transport, and nutrient fluxes that we know are important for ecological values. They support river complexity and diverse habitats. Also, we know that designation requires application of the highest water quality standards, so that's certainly something that is contributing to conservation as well as the ecological values of the critters that are living along the river. And also the ORVs, which include these sensitive aquatic species, including fish, mussels, and plants. So wild and scenic rivers are places that are protecting all of these things. So they are wonderful, but they're not perfect, and there are some limitations of wild and scenic rivers. One of the things that is, challenging is that a river, when it's designated, it's a finite segment, so it doesn't usually protect the entire upstream and downstream parts of the river. And so, there's things that you have to deal with and manage that you may not have a lot of control over when you're working on these rivers. But where they are found, what we know is that wild and scenic rivers, as well as these other protected areas, there is evidence that they are really truly supporting diversity and abundance of native populations at higher rates than you would find outside of these protected areas. Conservation of riverine ecosystems requires a combination of protected areas, restoration efforts. So we're not just protecting areas that we want to keep pristine, but we also want to work to restore some of these functions and processes in rivers or other ecosystems where we can. And some of the characteristics of a healthy or wild river we can use in our restoration efforts on other rivers. So that's something to think about. But to protect these rivers, we also need to think about in-stream flow provisions. Water rights is a tough thing. But the important point is that you don't need all of the water in the river. There are ways of ensuring that there's those functional flows that you need for different species, as well as being able to have water for other uses. But you really do need to have some way of ensuring that there's flow in the river, because without that, there isn't a river. And so finally, land use policies also are really important in protecting rivers. So it's not just the water, it's not just the river itself, but what's going on outside of the river corridor. And so finally, and this is something that I found when I was working for the National Park Service, working with a group of rivers that we call these partnership rivers, like the Wekiva, where there's no federal lands. There's no federal presence on the river, but the federal agency provides technical and financial assistance. But what we see is that when there are partnerships between federal, whether it's federal and local, between states and local communities, those are the strongest and most robust protections, I think, that a river can have. So we really want to have these different communities, different agencies, different groups coming together and agreeing on a future for a particular river or river segment. And so that's all I have. So thank you. So, any questions?
We have a few minutes for Q&A, and I will be bringing this mic around because it connects the audio to the live feed. So if you raise your hand with a question, I'll just come bring you the mic, and then you can speak into it and Jennifer will answer.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I have the feeling that we're mostly directed towards the crystal at this point. At least that's what I seem to have read. And my question is, what recreational activities are allowed, if any, on wild and scenic rivers, such as rafting, fly fishing, etc.?
It all has to do with what your outstandingly remarkable values are for the river. If you want recreation to be an outstandingly remarkable value, you can describe all of the parts or opportunities for recreation that you want to see on that river. So, for example, the Cache-la-Poudre River has an ORV of recreation. And that ORV actually includes not just boating, but fishing. And so by having both of those activities described in the ORV, the management focus is on supporting both of those things. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
What's really the process for getting a river designated as a wild and scenic river?
So there's a lot of different ways it happens, but the best way is when a local community decides that's what they want, and they sort of elevate it, whether they have a congressperson that's advocating for them. But those are really the best way that might happen. When we talk about designation, there's essentially, they say there's really three different ways it happens. States can actually designate rivers, and we call these 2A2I rivers. It's based on the section in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that allows them to do that. But so a state can propose a river for designation. There's some criteria they have to meet to do that. The most common way that a river is designated has to do with, again, this idea of a group, whether it's a tribe, a community, or some sort of coalition, advocates for designation, gets someone in Congress to sponsor a bill to do a study of a river and determine whether it's eligible. And then once that eligibility study is done, if the river is found eligible, then there can be this recommendation to designate. The other way, and the way that what's happening on the Crystal, the way that I think more recently we're seeing this, federal agencies are now required to evaluate. They've always been required, but it wasn't. There wasn't as heavy a push to do it in the past. But federal agencies, all four federal agencies, and even non-land management agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, are supposed to evaluate rivers for their eligibility for designation before they do anything else on the river. So, when the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management puts forth a new land management plan or a forest plan, in the Park Service it was a little bit different. But anyway, when you put forth a management plan like that, you are supposed to consider a river's eligibility. And so what that does, it sort of takes out one of the steps where a community doesn't have to get Congress to authorize a study, but the land management agency is actually has to do the study. So, so a little bit different ways that happens. But again, even when a federal agency finds a river eligible and suitable for designation, then there's this, in any of these ways that a river gets designated, there has to be outreach and public comment and all of that kind of stuff. So it's complicated and it's not easy, but yeah, there are these different ways of for it to happen. Does that help you? Yeah. Okay, good.
Thank you. Just a question about, is it have to be, is it defined just to rivers? Can streams qualify? Can creeks qualify?
In fact, there's no minimum length, really. In the first, I think, 15 years or so, there was a minimum length, and then they changed that. But the shortest segment that I'm aware of is less than half a mile. It's like 4/10 of a mile. It's an underground river. It's actually in a cave. So yeah, they can be very short. They can be small segments. I think for the most part, depending on what your ORVs are, you might need a longer segment to protect that value. But certainly there are cultural features that we might want to have as an ORV, and perhaps they don't need a huge length of river to be able to protect that cultural value or something like that. So there's no minimum length, there's no minimum flow or anything like that, although they do have to have flow. I don't think there are any ephemeral rivers in the wild and scenic river system. The Amargosa that I showed earlier does have these perennial streams or perennial segments, but there are segments of that river that are not designated that don't have flow all year. But so anyway, yeah, you can have some small segments. The other thing is that we're starting to see this idea of headwater streams being protected, and so certainly a lot of those are very small, but there are places where that has happened, where some small, usually they're connected, not just one little one, but a group of connected ones that are people are trying to protect those. So yeah, sure.
Thank you for your presentation. Does it disqualify a river if it is downstream from a dam and its flow is regulated?
You would think so. So let me give you an example. The Rio Chama in New Mexico, not so far from here, is right below a fairly big dam. In fact, I think the designation starts 1 foot below the dam, literally. The flows are regulated. It was a river that was designated very early on. It's managed by the Bureau of Land Management. I really don't know the history of how it came about that it was designated. And frankly, it provides habitat for some different species that are otherwise, they're endemic. They don't occur anywhere else. So it does have some value to, and what you hear the people that live in that area say is that, yes, we understand that that the flows are regulated essentially, but they are supporting these different values. So I don't think there are any fish values. There may be recreation on that river. I'm not quite sure, but if there are fish values, it's probably introduced species or sport fishing or that kind of thing. But yeah, no. So we do have some rivers that are right below dams. The Rio Chama, I think, is a pretty unique situation where the flow is so regulated. But there are some rivers like that. Yeah. So somehow.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
Awesome. You worked for the Park Service, and everybody says, "Oh, America's greatest or best idea was the national parks." Are there wild and scenic rivers designated in other countries as well? Do you know of that? And maybe some examples. And I think is it the Dolores River in Colorado is also below a dam, and maybe that's wild and scenic, but I don't know. I just thought I'd ask.
Not designated, yeah, no. But so only the Cache la Poudre in Colorado is currently designated. Your question about whether there are other countries that have this system, no. But there's actually a lot of interest in, mostly that I'm familiar with, European countries, and they've come to us and asked us about well, when I was still working, asked us about how we did it and what were the benefits. A lot of the European countries have hydropower, existing hydropower. It's a large source of energy for them, but they still want to protect certain segments of rivers. And so I think it's the World Wildlife Fund is really working with communities in Europe, different organizations, to try to establish some sort of similar protections in some ways. There's also some efforts in different countries to give rivers rights. And I don't really know a lot about that, quite honestly. But there are these other efforts that are going on. I think what's happening in these European countries might be the best, most similar efforts that are happening. So yeah, I call the Wild and Scenic River System America's second best idea. So, so yeah.
All right, that's our time. So let's all give.
Thank you.
And if anyone is feeling inspired, Wilderness Workshop has provided a petition that you can sign and help support their work in giving the Crystal River that wild and scenic designation. And that's just on the table on your way out. Thank you all so much for coming, and please join us in 2 weeks for our next Naturalist Night speaker.